June 9th, AD 68. A villa outside Rome. Nero, Emperor of Rome, the most powerful man on earth, was hiding in a basement. His empire had turned against him. The Senate had declared him an enemy of the state. The Praetorian Guard, his own bodyguards, had switched sides. Soldiers were hunting him through the streets of Rome. Nero was 30 years old. He had been emperor for 14 years. He had murdered his mother, his wife, his stepbrother, and countless others. He had watched Rome burn and possibly started the fire himself. He had persecuted Christians by using them as human torches to light his gardens. Now he was alone, terrified, and facing execution. His few remaining servants urged him to kill himself before he was captured. Roman execution meant being stripped naked, having your neck placed in a wooden fork, and being beaten to death with rods in the public square. Nero couldn't do it. He held a dagger to his throat but couldn't push. He wept and cried, "What an artist dies in me!" Finally, as he heard soldiers approaching, his secretary helped him, guiding Nero's hand as he drove the blade into his own throat. Nero died gurgling blood, his last words barely intelligible. The soldiers arrived moments later to find the emperor dead in a pool of blood. With Nero's death, the Julio-Claudian Dynasty, the first imperial family of Rome, came to an end after 96 years, 5 emperors, 5 reigns defined by murder, madness, and betrayal. A family that ruled the greatest empire in the ancient world while destroying itself from within. Augustus, who transformed Rome from a republic into an empire. Tiberius, who became a paranoid recluse. Caligula, whose insanity shocked even Romans accustomed to cruelty. Claudius, who was thought an idiot but proved surprisingly competent. And Nero, whose name became synonymous with tyranny. Every single one of them was either murdered, forced to commit suicide, or died under deeply suspicious circumstances. The Julio-Claudian Dynasty was Rome's first imperial family. And it was cursed from the beginning, cursed by ambition, by incest, by the corrupting nature of absolute power. This is the story of that curse, of how one family seized control of the greatest empire on earth and then tore itself apart. This is blood and betrayal, the curse of the Julio-Claudian Dynasty. To understand the curse, you must first understand how it began. Rome, in the 1st century BC, was the most powerful state in the Mediterranean. Roman legions had conquered Greece, Carthage, Gaul, Egypt, and countless other territories. But Rome itself was dying. For 500 years, Rome had been a republic, governed by the Senate, led by elected consuls, bound by laws that limited any individual's power. But by 50 BC, that system was collapsing. Military generals commanded personal armies more loyal to them than to Rome. Civil wars erupted repeatedly. The government was corrupt, ineffective, and paralyzed by factional conflict. 3 men dominated Rome: Pompey the Great, Marcus Licinius Crassus, and Julius Caesar. Together they formed an unofficial alliance called the First Triumvirate, essentially ruling Rome through military power and political manipulation. But in 53 BC, Crassus was killed fighting the Parthians. The alliance collapsed. Pompey and Caesar became rivals. In 49 BC, Caesar crossed the Rubicon River with his army, an act of treason, and plunged Rome into civil war. Caesar won. He defeated Pompey's forces. He became dictator of Rome with near absolute power. For 4 years, Caesar ruled as dictator. He reformed the calendar, the Senate, the government. He was brilliant, ambitious, and seemingly unstoppable. But on March 15th, 44 BC, the Ides of March, a group of senators led by Brutus and Cassius, assassinated Caesar, stabbing him 23 times in the Senate chamber. The assassins believed they were saving the Republic. Instead, they triggered another civil war that would destroy the Republic forever. And they set in motion the events that would create the Julio-Claudian Dynasty. When Julius Caesar died, he left behind a will that shocked everyone. He named as his primary heir his 18-year-old great-nephew Gaius Octavius. Caesar legally adopted Octavius in his will, making him Caesar's son. No one expected this. Octavius was young, sickly, politically inexperienced, and had no military command. But Octavius, now calling himself Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, or Octavian, was far more capable than anyone realized. He was cold, calculating, and ruthlessly pragmatic. He understood power in ways that would have impressed even his great uncle. Octavian formed an alliance with Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. Together, the second triumvirate, they hunted down Caesar's assassins. At the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, Brutus and Cassius were defeated. Both committed suicide. Caesar's assassination was avenged. But then Octavian and Antony turned on each other. For over a decade, they maneuvered for control of Rome. Antony ruled the eastern provinces from Egypt, where he had become the lover of Cleopatra, Egypt's queen. Octavian controlled the west from Rome and launched a propaganda campaign portraying Antony as bewitched by Cleopatra, abandoning Roman values for Eastern decadence. In 31 BC, at the Battle of Actium off the coast of Greece, Octavian's fleet defeated Antony and Cleopatra's forces. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt. 1 year later, as Octavian's armies approached Alexandria, both committed suicide. Octavian was now the undisputed master of Rome. At age 32, he controlled an empire stretching from Spain to Syria, from Egypt to Gaul. The Republic was dead, but Octavian was clever enough not to say so openly. In 27 BC, Octavian appeared before the Senate and offered to give up his extraordinary powers and restore the Republic. The Senate, carefully stage-managed by Octavian's supporters, refused. They begged him to continue leading Rome. They granted him a new title, Augustus, meaning the revered one. Octavian became Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Though he carefully maintained the fiction that Rome was still a republic, in reality, he was an autocrat with absolute power. The Julio-Claudian Dynasty had begun. Augustus ruled Rome for 41 years from 27 BC to AD 14. He transformed Rome from a republic, tearing itself apart into a stable empire. He reformed the government, rebuilt the city, and established the Pax Romana, 2 centuries of relative peace and prosperity. Augustus was a political genius. He understood that Romans hated monarchy, so he carefully avoided calling himself king. He used titles like first citizen and claimed to be merely Rome's leading senator. But everyone knew the truth. Augustus controlled the legions. He appointed governors. He made all major decisions. He was emperor in all but name. Augustus lived modestly, or at least he appeared to. His house on the Palatine Hill was relatively simple compared to the mansions of wealthy senators. He wore plain togas. He ate simple food. But beneath this modest exterior was absolute power. Augustus could have anyone executed. He controlled Rome's vast wealth. He decided war and peace. And he was obsessed with creating a dynasty to succeed him. This obsession would create the curse that would destroy his family. Augustus had no sons. His only child was his daughter, Julia, from his first marriage. So Augustus needed to find suitable heirs and build a dynasty through careful marriages and adoptions. He married Julia to his nephew Marcellus, Augustus's sister's son. Marcellus was young, capable, and seemed perfect as heir. But in 23 BC, Marcellus died suddenly of illness at age 19. Augustus then married Julia to his closest friend and general, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. Agrippa was much older than Julia, but capable and loyal. Julia and Agrippa had 5 children together. Augustus adopted the 2 eldest boys, Gaius and Lucius Caesar, making them his legal heirs. But then Agrippa died in the 12 BC, and Julia, still young and beautiful, was left a widow. Augustus married her to his stepson Tiberius, the son of Augustus's wife Livia from her first marriage. But there was a problem. Tiberius was already married to a woman he loved. Augustus forced him to divorce her and marry Julia. Tiberius resented this. Julia resented being married to a man she didn't love. The marriage was miserable from the start. Then tragedy struck again. Both of Augustus's adopted heirs, Gaius and Lucius Caesar, died young. Gaius died in AD 4 at age 23 from wounds sustained in battle. Lucius had died 2 years earlier at age 18 from sudden illness. Both deaths were suspiciously convenient for Tiberius, who now became the obvious heir. Rumours spread that Livia, Tiberius's mother and Augustus's wife, had poisoned both young men to secure succession for her son. We'll never know the truth, but the rumours reflect the paranoia and suspicion that surrounded imperial succession. With his grandsons dead, Augustus had no choice. In AD 4, he formally adopted Tiberius as his son and heir. The succession was set, but the family was already dysfunctional and violent. Julia, Augustus's daughter, became one of the most scandalous figures in Roman history. She was beautiful, intelligent, witty, and sexually liberated in a way that shocked Roman society. Despite being married 3 times, all marriages arranged by her father for political purposes, Julia conducted numerous affairs with senators and aristocrats. She made little effort to hide her affairs. She allegedly hosted orgies, had sex in public places including the Forum, and openly mocked her father's conservative moral legislation. Someone once asked Julia how her children could look like her husband Agrippa despite her numerous affairs. She replied, "I never take on a passenger until the ship is full," meaning she only had affairs when already pregnant by her husband. Augustus, who had passed strict laws against adultery and promoted traditional family values, was humiliated by his daughter's behaviour. In some BC, Augustus took drastic action. He exiled Julia to a tiny island, Pandateria, where she lived in harsh conditions under guard. Augustus never forgave her. When he died 12 years later, he had still not allowed Julia to return. She died in exile in AD 14, the same year as her father. Julia's daughter, also named Julia, followed her mother's path. She too conducted scandalous affairs and was exiled by Augustus. The women of the Julio-Claudian family were caught in an impossible situation. They were used as political pawns, married off repeatedly to secure alliances, but any attempt to exercise personal freedom or power resulted in exile or death. Augustus died on August 19th, AD 14th, at age 75. He had ruled Rome for 41 years. He had transformed chaos into order. He had established an imperial system that would last 4 centuries. But he had also failed to create a stable succession. His preferred heirs had all died young. His daughter had died in disgrace. His family was dysfunctional and suspicious. And now Tiberius, a man Augustus had never particularly liked or trusted, would become the second emperor of Rome. According to rumour, Augustus's last words were, "I found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble." But others claimed his actual last words, spoken to his wife Livia, were, "Remember our marriage, Livia, and farewell," a reference to their long partnership in ruling Rome and perhaps in eliminating rivals. Some whispered that Livia had poisoned Augustus to ensure Tiberius inherited before Augustus could change his mind again. We'll never know. But the rumours demonstrate how poisoned, literally and figuratively, the Julio-Claudian family had become. Tiberius became emperor at age 55. He was an experienced general and administrator. He had served Rome loyally for decades. He was capable, intelligent, and should have been a good emperor. But Tiberius was also bitter, resentful, and increasingly paranoid. He had never wanted to be emperor. He had been forced to divorce the woman he loved. He had been pushed into a miserable marriage with Julia. He had waited decades to inherit, watching younger rivals die suspiciously. For the first few years, Tiberius ruled reasonably well. He was competent, if uninspiring, but gradually his paranoia increased. He saw conspiracies everywhere. He relied increasingly on informers and treason trials to eliminate suspected enemies. In AD 26, Tiberius did something extraordinary. He left Rome entirely and retired to the island of Capri. For the last 11 years of his life, Tiberius ruled the Roman Empire from Capri, never returning to the capital. Why? The official reason was that he wanted privacy and peace. But rumours suggested darker motives. Ancient historians claimed Tiberius turned Capri into a pleasure island where he indulged in every sexual perversion imaginable. Suetonius, writing decades later, described Tiberius engaging in orgies, pedophilia, and other depravities. How much of this is true is debatable. Roman historians love scandalous stories about emperors they disapproved of. But Tiberius's self-imposed exile was real, and it left a power vacuum in Rome that was filled by the Praetorian prefect, Sejanus. Lucius Aelius Sejanus was commander of the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal military force stationed in Rome. With Tiberius on Capri, Sejanus became the most powerful man in Rome. He controlled access to the emperor. He ran the government. He eliminated rivals through treason trials. Sejanus was ambitious. He wanted to become emperor himself, or at least marry into the imperial family to secure his position. He seduced Livilla, the emperor's niece and daughter-in-law. Together, they allegedly plotted to eliminate other potential heirs. In AD 23, Livilla's husband Drusus, Tiberius's son and designated heir, died suddenly. Rumours immediately spread that Sejanus and Livilla had poisoned him. With Drusus dead, Sejanus manoeuvred to eliminate other rivals. He convinced Tiberius that various family members were plotting against him. One by one, they were arrested, exiled, or executed. But Sejanus overplayed his hand. In AD 31, Tiberius finally realized Sejanus was plotting to seize power. Tiberius acted decisively. He sent a letter to the Senate denouncing Sejanus. The Praetorian Guard, loyal to Tiberius, arrested Sejanus in the Senate chamber. Sejanus was strangled that same day. His body was thrown down the Gemonian stairs and left to rot. His children were also executed, including a young daughter who was raped before execution because Roman law forbade executing virgins. Sejanus' fall triggered a purge. Anyone associated with him was arrested. Hundreds were executed. The paranoia and violence escalated. Tiberius remained on Capri, ruling through letters and messengers, while Rome filled with informers and terror. Tiberius died on March 16, AD 37 at age 77. The circumstances were suspicious. Ancient sources suggest he was smothered with a pillow or poisoned, possibly by Macro, the new Praetorian prefect, acting on behalf of the next emperor. Romans celebrated Tiberius' death. Crowds chanted, "Tiberius to the Tiber," demanding his body be thrown in the river like a common criminal. Tiberius had become one of Rome's most hated emperors. His reign had started with promise, but descended into paranoia, treason trials, and terror. But what came next would make Romans nostalgic for Tiberius' reign, because the new emperor was Gaius, better known by his nickname, Caligula. Caligula was 24 years old when he became emperor. He was the son of Germanicus, a beloved general and Augustus' adopted grandson. Germanicus had been immensely popular, so popular that Tiberius may have seen him as a threat. In AD 19, Germanicus died suddenly in Syria at age 33. Poisoning was suspected, possibly ordered by Tiberius. Germanicus' widow, Agrippina the Elder, openly accused Tiberius of murder. She and her sons, potential heirs, became targets of Tiberius' paranoia. Agrippina was exiled and starved to death. Her eldest son was also exiled and forced to commit suicide. Her second son died suspiciously. Only Caligula survived, possibly because he seemed harmless, possibly because he cleverly avoided giving Tiberius any reason to see him as a threat. When Caligula became emperor, Romans were ecstatic. He was young, handsome, the son of the beloved Germanicus. He promised to end Tiberius' terror and restore justice. For the first few months, Caligula was a model emperor. He declared amnesties, recalled exiles, ended treason trials, and was generous to the people. But then in October AD 37, just 6 months into his reign, Caligula fell seriously ill with a high fever. He nearly died. When he recovered, Caligula was changed. Something in his mind had broken. What followed was 4 years of insanity that shocked even Romans accustomed to imperial excess. Caligula declared himself a living god and demanded to be worshipped. He built a temple to himself and appointed his favorite horse, Incitatus, as a priest. He allegedly planned to make the horse a consul, the highest political office in Rome. He had conversations with statues of gods. He claimed to have sex with the moon goddess. He stood next to statues of Jupiter and asked visitors which of them looked more godlike. He built a pontoon bridge across the Bay of Naples, nearly 2 miles long, just so he could ride his horse across it while wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate. It cost a fortune and served no purpose. He hosted lavish banquets where he would suddenly order guests executed for no reason. He forced senators to run beside his chariot for miles as entertainment. He committed incest with his sisters, particularly Drusilla, whom he loved obsessively. When Drusilla died in AD 38, possibly from illness, Caligula was devastated. He declared her a goddess and made it a capital crime to laugh, bathe, or to dine with family during the mourning period. He executed people on whims. He tortured victims personally, remarking, "Make him feel that he is dying." He bankrupted the treasury through extravagant spending, then replenished it by confiscating property from wealthy citizens on false charges. He planned to move the capital from Rome to Alexandria and wanted to erect a giant statue of himself in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, a plan that nearly triggered a Jewish revolt. Most historians believe Caligula was genuinely insane. Some suggest the illness that nearly killed him caused brain damage. Others think absolute power combined with childhood trauma, watching his family murdered by Tiberius, broke his mind. Whatever the cause, Rome suffered under his madness for 4 years. On January 24th, AD 41, a group of Praetorian guards had enough. As Caligula left a theatrical performance through an underground corridor beneath the palace, the conspirators attacked. The leader, Cassius Chaerea, struck first. He was a Praetorian tribune whom Caligula had repeatedly mocked for his effeminate voice. Chaerea stabbed Caligula in the neck. Other conspirators joined in. Caligula was stabbed 30 times. He fell, crying out, "I am still alive!" The soldiers continued stabbing until he was dead. The assassins then found Caligula's wife Caesonia, an infant daughter, Julia Drusilla. They killed them both, smashing the baby's head against a wall. Caligula was 28 years old. He had ruled for just 3 years, 10 months, and 8 days. Romans celebrated. Surely they thought the nightmare was over. But the Praetorian Guard now realized something important. They could make emperors. Whoever they supported would become emperor. This realization would haunt Rome for centuries. After Caligula's assassination, the Praetorian Guard searched the palace looking for any remaining family members to kill or capture. They found Caligula's uncle, Claudius, hiding behind a curtain, terrified he would be murdered next. Claudius was 50 years old. He had never held major political office. He was considered an embarrassment to the family. He stuttered, drooled, had a limp, and seemed intellectually disabled. Augustus had excluded him from public life. Caligula had kept him around as a fool for entertainment. But the Praetorian Guards saw opportunity. Claudius was the only adult male member of the Julio-Claudian family still alive. If they made him emperor, he would owe them everything. They dragged Claudius to their barracks and declared him emperor. The Senate surrounded by armed soldiers, had no choice but to confirm him. Everyone expected Claudius to be a puppet emperor, controlled by the Praetorians and his advisors. They were wrong. Claudius proved to be surprisingly competent. His physical disabilities were real. He did stutter and shake, but his mind was sharp. He was a scholar who had written histories and studied law. As emperor, Claudius reformed the government, built infrastructure, improved the legal system, and expanded the empire. He conquered Britain in AD 43, the first Roman emperor to add significant new territory since Augustus. He built harbours, aqueducts, and roads. He granted citizenship to provincials and promoted men of talent regardless of birth. But Claudius had one fatal weakness. He trusted the women in his life. His third wife, Messalina, was beautiful, sexually insatiable, and ruthlessly ambitious. While Claudius worked on government, Messalina conducted numerous affairs, accumulated wealth through corruption, and eliminated rivals by accusing them of treason. She allegedly competed with a prostitute to see who could have sex with more men in one night, and won, servicing 25 men. Most shockingly, in AD 48, while Claudius was away from Rome, Messalina went through a public marriage ceremony with one of her lovers, Gaius Silius. Whether this was a drunken game or an actual plot to overthrow Claudius is unclear. But when Claudius learned of it, he was forced to act. Messalina was executed. Silius and dozens of others involved were killed. Claudius, devastated, swore he would never marry again. He lasted a year before remarrying. His fourth wife would be his doom. Agrippina the Younger was Claudius's niece, the daughter of Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder, and the great-granddaughter of Augustus. She was beautiful, intelligent, and ruthlessly ambitious. She had already been married twice and had a son from her first marriage, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, who would later be renamed Nero. Agrippina wanted power, and she saw Claudius as her path to it. She convinced Claudius to marry her in AD 49. Roman law forbade uncle-niece marriages, so the law was changed. Once married, Agrippina dominated Claudius. She eliminated rivals. She accumulated titles and honours. She had her son Nero adopted by Claudius and positioned as heir ahead of Claudius's own biological son, Britannicus. She appeared on coins alongside Claudius, unprecedented for an empress. She was given the title Augusta, making her effectively co-ruler. Agrippina was creating a power base. When Claudius died, her son would become emperor, and she would be the power behind the throne. But Claudius was healthy and might live for years, and he was starting to regret adopting Nero, beginning to favour his own son Britannicus again. Agrippina couldn't risk that. So in AD 54, she acted. On October 13th, AD 54, Claudius died suddenly after eating mushrooms at dinner. The official story was food poisoning, but everyone suspected murder. Ancient sources claim Agrippina poisoned Claudius's favourite dish, mushrooms, with a deadly toxin possibly extracted from death-cap mushrooms or some other poison. Some versions say the poison wasn't strong enough, so Agrippina had Claudius's doctor, Xenophon, finish him by sticking a poisoned feather down his throat under the pretense of helping him vomit. Claudius died in agony. Agrippina delayed announcing his death for hours, ensuring Nero could secure the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard before anyone could rally around Britannicus. When the news was finally announced, Nero was proclaimed emperor. He was 16 years old. Claudius was declared a god, ironically enough. His deification ceremony became a joke in Rome. Nero's advisor Seneca wrote a satire about it called The Pumpkinification of Claudius, mocking the dead emperor's transformation into a god. Agrippina had succeeded. Her son was emperor. She was the most powerful woman in Rome, but mother and son would soon turn on each other in a conflict that would end in matricide. Nero's reign began well. For the first 5 years, Rome was governed by Nero's advisors, Seneca, the philosopher, and Burrus, the Praetorian prefect. They ran the empire while Nero enjoyed himself. Nero was interested in arts, music, poetry, and theatre, not government. He wanted to be an artist, not an emperor. But Agrippina wanted to rule through her son. She attended Senate meetings. She interfered in government. She expected Nero to obey her. Nero resented this. He was emperor, but his mother treated him like a child. The conflict escalated when Nero fell in love with Poppaea Sabina, a beautiful and ambitious woman. But Nero was already married to Claudius's daughter Octavia, whom Agrippina had arranged for him to marry to legitimize his claim to the throne. Poppaea wanted to become empress. Agrippina opposed this, knowing it would undermine her own power. Nero and Agrippina fought constantly. She threatened to support Britannicus, Claudius's biological son, as the rightful emperor. In AD 55, Britannicus died suddenly at a dinner party, poisoned. He was just 14 years old. Everyone knew Nero had killed him to eliminate a rival. Agrippina's threats now rang hollow. With Britannicus dead, she had no leverage. So Nero decided to eliminate her too. Nero tried to murder his mother multiple times. First he tried poison, but Agrippina had been taking small doses of various poisons for years to build immunity, a common practice among the paranoid Roman elite. Then Nero designed an elaborate trap. He had a special boat built that would collapse and sink when triggered. He invited Agrippina on a pleasure cruise. The boat did collapse, but Agrippina swam to safety, realizing it was an assassination attempt. Finally, in AD 59, Nero gave up subtlety. He sent soldiers to Agrippina's villa with orders to kill her. When the soldiers arrived, Agrippina knew why they were there. According to legend, she pointed to her womb and said, "Strike here," meaning kill her in the belly that had borne such a monstrous son. The soldiers stabbed her repeatedly. Agrippina the Younger, great-granddaughter of Augustus, died at age 44, murdered on her son's orders. Nero's mother, the woman who had schemed, murdered, and manipulated to make him emperor, dead because he wanted to marry a different woman and rule without interference. The matricide shocked even Romans accustomed to imperial violence. Killing your own mother violated the most sacred Roman values. Nero tried to justify it, claiming Agrippina had been plotting against him. Few believed it. But Nero was emperor. He had the army's loyalty. The Senate voted to praise him for saving Rome from his mother's alleged conspiracy. One senator abstained. Thrasea Paetus, a Stoic philosopher who refused to participate in the hypocrisy. Nero would remember this insult years later. After killing his mother, Nero's reign deteriorated. He divorced Octavia and married Poppaea. When public opinion turned against him for this, Octavia was popular. Nero had her exiled and then executed. He performed publicly as a singer and lyre player, forcing senators and aristocrats to attend his performances and applaud. For Romans, it was humiliating that their emperor behaved like a common entertainer. He created the Neronian Games, where he forced nobles to perform in athletic competitions and theatrical performances, activities Romans considered beneath aristocratic dignity. Then in July AD 64, disaster struck Rome. A massive fire broke out and burned for 6 days. 10 of Rome's 14 districts were destroyed. Thousands died. Hundreds of thousands were left homeless. Rumors immediately spread that Nero had started the fire to clear land for his planned new palace, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. The story that Nero fiddled while Rome burned is a myth. Fiddles didn't exist yet. But Nero did allegedly recite poetry about the burning of Troy while watching Rome burn from his palace tower. Whether Nero actually started the fire is debatable. He might have used an accidental fire as an opportunity, or the fire might have been genuinely accidental, and he was unfairly blamed. But Nero needed a scapegoat. So he blamed the Christians, a small Jewish sect that most Romans knew nothing about. Nero's persecution of Christians was horrific. They were torn apart by dogs, crucified, and burned alive as human torches to illuminate Nero's gardens at night. This persecution made Nero a villain in Christian tradition for 2,000 years. The Book of Revelation's number of the beast, 666, is thought by many scholars to be a coded reference to Nero. By AD 68, Nero's position was collapsing. The fire had destroyed much of Rome. The treasury was bankrupt from Nero's extravagant spending on the Golden House. The Senate hated him. The people were turning against him. Then the provinces rebelled. Governors in Gaul, Spain, and Africa declared against Nero and proclaimed their own emperors. The Praetorian Guard, always the kingmakers, withdrew their support. The Senate declared Nero a public enemy, meaning he could be executed without trial. Nero fled Rome with a few loyal servants. He hid in a villa just outside the city, planning to escape to Egypt. But his courage failed. As soldiers approached, he attempted suicide but couldn't bring himself to do it. Finally, with soldiers at the door, his secretary helped guide the blade into his throat. Nero died at age 30, having ruled for 13 years and 8 months. His alleged last words, "What an artist dies in me," capture his self-image perfectly. He saw himself as a misunderstood genius, not a tyrant. His death ended the Julio-Claudian Dynasty. There were no more direct descendants of Augustus, no clear heir. Rome plunged into civil war, the year of the 4 emperors, as multiple generals fought for the throne. The dynasty that began with Augustus's careful management ended with Nero bleeding out in a basement, having murdered his own mother and been declared an enemy by his own people. Looking back at the 5 Julio-Claudian emperors, we can see patterns that explain the dynasty's curse. First, Augustus's succession planning was a disaster. He had no sons, so he created a system based on adoptions and marriages that created competing claims and resentments. Second, the imperial family was deeply inbred. Augustus married his daughter Julia to his stepson Tiberius, making them stepdaughter and stepfather as well as wife and husband. Claudius married his niece Agrippina. This level of close intermarriage created dysfunctional family dynamics. Third, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Each emperor had unlimited authority. There were no real checks on their power. They could order anyone killed, take any property, do anything they wanted. This level of power would corrupt anyone. Fourth, imperial paranoia was rational. Emperors had real reasons to fear assassination. Most of them were either murdered or forced to commit suicide. This fear drove them to execute suspected enemies, which created more enemies in a vicious cycle. Fifth, the women of the family, Julia, Agrippina the Elder, Agrippina the Younger, Messalina, were used as political pawns, but also wielded informal power that created conflicts. And sixth, the Praetorian Guard became kingmakers. Once they realized they could make and unmake emperors, stability became impossible. The Julio-Claudian dynasty was cursed not by the gods, but by its own internal contradictions. What was daily life like in Rome under the Julio-Claudians? For ordinary Romans, imperial politics were distant. Most people were concerned with feeding their families, not court intrigues. But the emperor's actions did affect ordinary lives. Wars meant taxes and military conscription. Building projects provided jobs. Political instability could disrupt trade and cause food shortages. The grain dole, free grain distributed to Roman citizens, was crucial for the urban poor. Emperors who ensured a steady grain supply were popular. Those who let shortages develop faced riots. Public entertainments, gladiatorial games, chariot races, theatrical performances were partly political tools. Emperors provided bread and circuses to keep the populace content. But even ordinary Romans weren't safe from imperial caprice. Anyone could be denounced to the emperor for treason, sometimes on the flimsiest evidence or out of personal grudges. Under Tiberius especially, the system of informers created an atmosphere of terror. People were afraid to speak freely, even in private. Neighbors denounced neighbors. Slaves testified against masters. The wealthy were particularly vulnerable. Emperors could confiscate property on any pretext. Being rich made you a target, not a source of security. Yet Rome itself thrived. The population grew to over 1 million, the largest city in the ancient world. Trade flourished. Art and literature continued. Life went on even as the imperial family destroyed itself. The genius of Augustus's system was that it created institutions strong enough to function even when emperors were incompetent, insane, or absent. The bureaucracy, the army, the courts, all continued operating regardless of who sat on the throne. This is why Rome survived the Julio-Claudians. The system was stronger than any individual emperor. But it was still a fundamentally unstable system, dependent on the character of whoever happened to be born or adopted into the imperial family. The Roman Senate's role during the Julio-Claudian era was tragic. For 5 centuries, the Senate had governed Rome as a republic. Senators were the aristocratic elite, wealthy landowners who controlled policy and elected magistrates. But under the emperors, the Senate became a rubber stamp. Emperors consulted the Senate, pretended to respect them, and maintained the fiction of a republican government. But everyone knew the Senate had no real power. Senators who opposed emperors were executed, exiled, or forced to commit suicide. Those who survived learned to be obsequious and compliant. The Senate voted to deify emperors after their deaths. Even terrible emperors like Caligula and Nero initially received this honor, later revoked. They praised emperors for obvious crimes. They applauded theatrical performances they found humiliating. Some senators maintained dignity through Stoic philosophy, quietly resisting in small ways. Thrasea Paetus, who refused to praise Nero for matricide, eventually was forced to commit suicide, but did so with philosophical calm. Others became informers and collaborators, profiting from the system by denouncing colleagues. The Senate's degradation under the Julio-Claudians was emblematic of how autocracy corrupts institutions. What had been a body of dignified statesmen became a collection of terrified sycophants, yet the Senate survived. It would outlast the Julio-Claudians and continue for centuries, though never regaining its republican authority. The military under the Julio-Claudians transformed Rome's relationship with its army. Under the Republic, legions were citizen soldiers who served for specific campaigns and then returned to civilian life. Generals commanded armies but weren't supposed to have permanent military power. Augustus changed this. He created a professional standing army, legions permanently stationed on the frontiers, soldiers who served for 25 years. This army was loyal not to Rome or the Senate, but to the emperor who paid their salaries and promised them bonuses. The Praetorian Guard, created by Augustus as his personal bodyguard, became even more problematic. 9 cohorts of elite soldiers stationed in Rome itself, close to the center of power. The Praetorians learned they could make emperors. They proclaimed Claudius emperor. They supported Nero until they turned on him. They would eventually auction the imperial throne to the highest bidder. On the frontiers, the legions remained more disciplined. They built roads, fortifications, and cities. They maintained the borders against Germanic tribes, Parthians, and other enemies. But even frontier legions could become kingmakers. In AD 68, when provincial governors rebelled against Nero, their legions supported them. The year of the 4 emperors that followed Nero's death showed the danger clearly. Multiple armies fighting each other, each supporting their own candidate for emperor. The military problem would haunt Rome for centuries. Emperors needed the army's loyalty to rule, but the army could destroy emperors it didn't like. It was an inherently unstable system that the Julio-Claudians created but couldn't solve. The Julio-Claudian Dynasty's relationship with conquered peoples reveals complex patterns. Augustus had expanded the empire aggressively, conquering Egypt, parts of Germany, and extending Roman control over client kingdoms. But after the Varian disaster in AD 9th, when 3 Roman legions were annihilated in Germany, Augustus advised his successors to maintain existing borders rather than expand. Tiberius followed this advice. He was a conservative emperor who focused on consolidating control rather than seeking glory through conquest. Caligula planned grand invasions of Britain and Germany, but accomplished nothing beyond theatrical gestures. Claudius was the exception. He successfully invaded Britain in AD 43, bringing the southern part of the island under Roman control. It was the first major territorial expansion in decades. Nero showed little interest in military glory, though his generals did fight wars in Britain, Armenia, and Judea. The Jewish War of AD 66 to 70, which began during Nero's reign, was particularly significant. It ended with the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem and the dispersal of the Jewish people, events that would echo through history. Roman imperialism under the Julio-Claudians was different from modern colonialism. Rome didn't seek to extract resources while maintaining conquered peoples as permanent inferiors. Instead, Rome offered a path to Roman citizenship. Provincial elites who adopted Roman culture, learned Latin, and served the empire could become Roman citizens with all attendant rights. This policy of gradual Romanization helped stabilize the empire. It gave conquered peoples a stake in the system rather than making them permanent subjects. But it also meant that Roman became an identity rather than an ethnicity. By the 2nd century AD, most Roman citizens weren't from Rome or even Italy. The Julio-Claudians began this process, though they didn't fully understand its implications. They were creating a multi-ethnic empire held together by Roman law, Latin language, and allegiance to the emperor. The fall of the Julio-Claudian dynasty triggered immediate crisis, but long-term stability. In AD 68-69, Rome experienced the year of the 4 emperors. 4 men claimed the throne in rapid succession: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian. Vespasian won the civil war and established a new dynasty, the Flavians. He was a military commander of relatively humble origins, not connected to the old aristocracy. This break with the Julio-Claudian dynasty was actually healthy for Rome. It showed that emperors didn't have to come from one family. It opened the door to meritocratic succession. The Flavian dynasty lasted just 27 years before giving way to the adoptive emperors, a period where emperors adopted their successors based on merit rather than blood. The adoptive emperors, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, presided over Rome's golden age in the 2nd century AD. This system worked because it avoided the problems that destroyed the Julio-Claudians: incompetent heirs, family intrigues, succession crises. But eventually, Marcus Aurelius broke the pattern by naming his biological son Commodus as heir. Commodus proved to be another Caligula, insane, cruel, and incompetent. Rome fell back into civil war, showing that the lessons of the Julio-Claudians hadn't been fully learned. The fundamental problem, how to ensure competent succession in a hereditary autocracy, would plague Rome for its entire history. Modern popular culture has kept the Julio-Claudians alive in collective memory. Robert Graves' novels I, Claudius, and Claudius the God, published in the 1930s, presented the dynasty through Claudius's eyes, portraying him as a wise observer of his family's madness. The 1976 BBC adaptation of I, Claudius became one of the most acclaimed historical dramas ever made, with John Hurt's portrayal of Caligula particularly memorable. More recently, films and shows have depicted various aspects of the dynasty. Gladiator, though set later, captured popular imagination about Roman imperial excess. Various documentaries have explored the archaeological and historical evidence. The fascination with the Julio-Claudians is understandable. Their story has everything: sex, violence, intrigue, madness, power struggles, and dramatic deaths. But popular depictions often sensationalize. Ancient historians like Suetonius and Tacitus loved scandalous stories, and their accounts, written decades after events, may exaggerate or invent details. Did Caligula really try to make his horse a consul? Probably not literally, though he may have joked about it to insult senators. Did Nero really fiddle while Rome burned? No, fiddles didn't exist. But he may have recited poetry, which would still have been offensive. Did Claudius drool and stagger like an idiot? He had real physical disabilities, but he was clearly intelligent and capable of governing. Separating historical reality from entertaining fiction is difficult with the Julio-Claudians, but the basic pattern is clear. A family given absolute power who destroyed themselves through that power's corrupting influence. What lessons can we draw from the Julio-Claudian dynasty? First, hereditary succession to absolute power is inherently problematic. When a position of supreme authority passes based on birth rather than merit, you'll inevitably get incompetent or unstable rulers. Second, absolute power does corrupt. Even relatively decent people like Tiberius became paranoid and cruel when given unlimited authority. And people with existing mental instability like Caligula became monsters. Third, family dynamics and political power should be separated. The Julio-Claudians' habit of using family members as political pawns, forcing divorces, arranged marriages, adoptions, created dysfunction that destabilized the empire. Fourth, institutions matter. Rome survived terrible emperors because Augustus had created systems that could function regardless of who held the throne. Fifth, military loyalty is crucial to political power. Every emperor who lost the army's support fell. This created perverse incentives where emperors focused on keeping soldiers happy rather than governing well. Sixth, persecution creates martyrs. Nero's persecution of Christians ultimately helped Christianity spread by giving the new religion martyrs and a narrative of heroic resistance to tyranny. And seventh, no family dynasty lasts forever. The Julio-Claudians ruled for less than a century before dying out. The Flavians lasted just 27 years. The Antonines lasted about a century. All dynasties fall eventually. The question is how much damage they do before falling. If we could somehow resurrect Augustus and show him what his dynasty became, What would he think? He would be horrified. Augustus spent 41 years carefully building a stable system. He worked to maintain the illusion of republican government. He lived modestly and promoted traditional Roman values. He would be shocked that Tiberius, his reluctant heir, abandoned Rome entirely and ruled from Capri. He would be appalled by Caligula's insanity, declaring himself a god committing incest, bankrupting the treasury. He would be dismayed by Claudius's marriages to Messalina and Agrippina, both of whom brought scandal and murder to the palace, and he would be devastated by Nero, the matricide, the artistic pretensions, the burning of Rome, the final ignominious suicide. Augustus's great-great-great-grandson, hiding in a basement, bleeding out with a dagger in his throat, declared an enemy of the state. This is how the dynasty ended. But Augustus might also recognize his own responsibility. He created a system of absolute power with no real checks. He established the precedent of adoption and dynastic succession. He concentrated too much authority in one person. The Julio-Claudian curse was built into the system Augustus created. He gave Rome stability and peace, but he also created the conditions for tyranny. Perhaps Augustus would conclude that the price of stability was too high. That trading republican chaos for imperial order meant eventually accepting imperial madness. Or perhaps he would argue that even bad emperors were better than civil war. That Rome prospered under his system, despite individual emperors' feelings. We'll never know. But the question remains relevant. How do you create stable government without creating tyranny? How do you vest necessary power in individuals without corrupting them? These are questions every society must answer. And the Julio-Claudians provide a cautionary tale about what happens when you get the answers wrong. The archaeological remains of the Julio-Claudian era still mark Rome today. Augustus's mausoleum, his tomb, still stands. Though heavily damaged and repurposed over centuries, it's currently being restored. The Ara Pacis, altar of peace, built by Augustus, has been reconstructed and sits in its own museum in Rome. Its exquisite marble reliefs celebrate Augustus's establishment of peace after decades of civil war. Tiberius's villa on Capri can still be visited. The ruins sprawl across the island's highest point, offering spectacular views that Tiberius enjoyed during his self-imposed exile. Caligula's constructions are mostly gone. His palace on the Palatine Hill was built over by later emperors. The ship he built for pleasure cruises on Lake Nemi was recovered in the 1930s but destroyed during World War II. Claudius's harbour at Ostia and his aqueducts still demonstrate his focus on practical infrastructure. Nero's golden house, the Domus Aurea, was buried by later emperors who wanted to erase his memory. It lay forgotten for centuries until rediscovered in the Renaissance. Today, you can tour its underground remains, seeing rooms that once glittered with gold, while Rome starved. The Colosseum, Rome's most famous monument, was built by Vespasian on the side of Nero's palace lake, a deliberate act of giving back to the people what Nero had taken for himself. These physical remains tell the story of the dynasty. Augustus's monuments celebrate peace and stability. Tiberius's villa represents withdrawal and paranoia. Caligula left almost nothing. His brief mad reign had no lasting impact. Claudius's works are practical and enduring. Nero's palace is buried and forgotten, a monument to his legacy of excess and tyranny. Rome literally built over the Julio-Claudians, using them as a foundation for something new. The Julio-Claudian women deserve special attention as they navigated impossible situations. In Roman society, women had no official political power. They couldn't vote, hold office, or command armies. They were under the legal authority of fathers or husbands. But imperial women found ways to exercise power through unofficial channels. Livia, Augustus's wife, was politically shrewd and possibly ruthless. She may have murdered rivals to secure succession for her son Tiberius. She accumulated unprecedented honours and influence. Julia the Elder, Augustus's daughter, rebelled against her role as political pawn through scandalous sexual behaviour. the only realm where she could exercise personal freedom. Agrippina the Elder openly defied Tiberius, demanding justice for her husband Germanicus' suspected murder. She paid for her defiance with exile and death. Messalina used her position as Claudius's wife to accumulate wealth and power, but her excesses, real or exaggerated, led to her execution. Agrippina the Younger was perhaps the most successfully powerful. She became empress, received titles, appeared on coins, and effectively co-ruled with Claudius. Then she made her son emperor and tried to rule through him. But even Agrippina couldn't escape the fundamental constraint. Her power was always derivative, dependent on relationships with men. When Nero decided he didn't need her anymore, he simply had her killed. Poppaea Sabina, Nero's second wife, influenced him significantly, but was ultimately vulnerable. When she criticized Nero for coming home late from the races, he reportedly kicked her to death. She was pregnant at the time. The women of the Julio-Claudian Dynasty showed remarkable intelligence and political skill, but they operated in a system designed to keep them powerless, and ultimately, none of them could transcend those limitations. Their stories are tragic examples of what happens when talented, ambitious people are denied legitimate paths to power. The end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty represents a turning point in Roman history. For a century, Rome had been ruled by one extended family descended from Augustus. This created continuity and legitimacy. Emperors could claim divine descent from the deified Augustus. But it also created the problems we've discussed: incompetent heirs, family intrigues, succession crises. When the dynasty ended with Nero's suicide, Rome faced an existential question. Who could legitimately rule? The answer that emerged from the year of the 4 emperors was whoever commanded enough military force to take and hold power. This was less stable. In some ways, military coups became a recurring problem, but it was more flexible. Competent generals from anywhere in the empire could become emperor. The next 3 centuries saw emperors from Spain, Trajan; North Africa, Septimius Severus; Syria, Elagabalus; and the Balkans, Diocletian. The empire became truly universal, not just a Roman institution. This evolution began with the Julio-Claudians' fall. Their dynasty's curse, inability to produce competent hereditary successors, forced Rome to develop other succession systems. Whether this was progress or just a different kind of instability is debatable. Rome never solved the succession problem. Every emperor faced potential military coups. Few died natural deaths, but the empire survived for nearly 4 more centuries in the west and over a millennium in the east. So whatever system evolved after the Julio-Claudians, it worked well enough. In the final analysis, the Julio-Claudian dynasty was both immensely successful and catastrophically flawed. Successful because Augustus transformed Rome from a republic, tearing itself apart into a stable empire that would last centuries. The Pax Romana brought unprecedented peace and prosperity. Roman law, architecture, literature, and culture flourished. The empire expanded to its greatest extent. Flawed because the system depended too much on individual emperors' character. There were no real constitutional checks on imperial power. Hereditary succession produced incompetent rulers. The concentration of power corrupted even initially decent emperors. The dynasty lasted 96 years and produced 5 emperors. Augustus, the founder, who ruled 41 years and established the imperial system. Tiberius, the reluctant heir, who became increasingly paranoid and withdrew from government. Caligula, the insane tyrant, whose brief reign shocked even Romans accustomed to imperial excess. Claudius, the unexpected emperor, who proved surprisingly competent, but was ultimately poisoned by his wife. Nero, the artist-tyrant, who ended the dynasty with matricide, the burning of Rome, and suicide. 3 of the 5 were murdered or forced to commit suicide. The other 2 died under suspicious circumstances. Not a single Julio-Claudian emperor died peacefully of natural causes while still ruling. This pattern reveals the curse at the dynasty's heart. Power attracted murder. Absolute authority created absolute paranoia. Family relationships became deadly rivalries. The dynasty that began with Augustus's dream of stable hereditary succession ended with Nero bleeding out in a basement, having murdered his own mother and been declared an enemy by his own empire. It was a curse not imposed by gods, but created by humans, by the corrupting influence of absolute power, by the impossible contradictions of hereditary autocracy, by the violence that power both requires and generates. The Julio-Claudian Dynasty ended on June 9th, AD 68, with Nero's suicide. But its legacy endures. The word Caesar became synonymous with emperor, German Kaiser, and Russian Tsar. Both derive from it. The month of July is named for Julius Caesar. August is named for Augustus. Roman law, based on foundations the Julio-Claudians built upon, influenced legal systems worldwide. The architectural and engineering achievements, aqueducts, roads, harbours, some still function 2,000 years later. And the stories, the scandals, the intrigues, the murders, the madness continue to fascinate. We remember Caligula making his horse a consul, probably false but memorable. We remember Nero fiddling while Rome burned, certainly false, but evocative. We remember Claudius being found behind a curtain and made emperor by soldiers. These stories endure because they reveal universal truths about power, corruption, family, ambition, and human nature. The Julio-Claudians were products of their specific time and place, but the dynamics that destroyed them, the corruption of absolute power, the dangers of hereditary succession, the violence inherent in politics, are timeless. Every age produces its own Julio-Claudians, families who seize power, rulers who abuse it, dynasties that self-destruct. The names change, the technology advances, but human nature remains constant. And so the Julio-Claudians remain relevant, not as ancient history, but as a mirror reflecting our own struggles with power, succession, corruption, and the eternal question: how do we govern ourselves without creating tyrants? Blood and betrayal, murder and madness, power and paranoia. The Julio-Claudian dynasty ruled Rome for 96 years. They transformed a republic into an empire. They brought peace after civil war. They built monuments that stand 2 millennia later. But they also murdered family members, persecuted enemies, bankrupted the treasury, and ultimately destroyed themselves. Augustus to Nero. From the founder who created an empire to the tyrant who died alone and hunted. 5 emperors, 5 reigns of increasing dysfunction, 5 lives that ended in suspicious circumstances or outright murder. A dynasty cursed not by fate, but by its own nature, by the concentration of power, by the corruption of absolute authority, by the impossibility of hereditary meritocracy. The Julio-Claudians rose to heights Rome had never imagined, and they fell into depths Rome hoped never to see again. Their story is Rome's story. Their curse is power's curse. And 2,000 years later, we're still learning the lessons they died teaching. This has been Bloodline Chronicles.